here. It's so wonderful to have y'all here. My name is Pastor Dustin Wright. I'm president of the New York State Council of Churches. And just a couple quick notes before I introduce Peter, who's going to introduce Mindy, and it's going to be fantastic. So number one, so the New York State Council of Churches is kind of an alliance of most of your mainline Protestant denominations throughout New York State. And we do three major things. We do a lot of advocacy work on the statewide level, and we also certify and support prison chaplains. And we also do events like this that are sort of educational, sort of, in some ways, faith formation events. So Heather, at this point, and there's some really big news, because as of just a couple hours ago at our last board meeting, we now have the official text to donate option. And I made these lovely little postcards that have our beloved executive director, Peter, on them. And so I had that Heather's passing out. And if you are like what you're hearing today, we encourage you to donate to our organization. And Peter is willing to sign the postcards at the end of the event. And also, of course, Mindy's publicist Lynn is here in the back. Wave, hi, Lynn. And so Mindy's books, as well as a bunch of other seemingly really interesting titles from New Village Press, are available for purchase today as well. And Lynn is very millennial friendly. She takes credit cards, so please see her at the end of the event. You get a signature from Peter. You can donate to the council. You get a book. It's going to be a wonderful evening. And with all that said, here is our executive director. Very photogenic, Mr. Peter Cook.
It's great to have all of you here with us. And thank you, Dustin, and good evening, everyone. And again, my name is Peter Cook. I'm the executive director of the New York State Council of Churches. It's about 7,000 congregations around the state, and one of our areas that we really can look at is the question of community development and housing. And so we just really want to thank you for coming this evening. When I look around the room, I'm really excited to see many of my friends and colleagues here who are working on lots of different issues, and I feel like you're going to bring a lot to this conversation, which is what this is going to be with Mindy. And some of you I'm also just meeting for the first time. And so it's just really exciting for us to have us all gathered here in this room to think about the work that we're going to do together and learn together. Now this evening's not really intended to be a lecture, although you are going to hear a really good lecture, but also really a conversation about community development, a conversation about displacement, a conversation about how we really truly include people instead of exclude them as we seek to build up communities which are nurturing and welcoming and which have real economic dimensions to it that take seriously the idea of displacement and gentrification. So this is really an opportunity for us as a community to reach out to our neighbors who have been dislocated or shunned in some way, and we're really trying to live into this powerful imperative of how it is that we love our neighbor as ourselves. So our next step is to convene a series of regional conferences to be held over the next year. Some will be in rural communities, some will be in suburban communities, some will be in urban communities. And I'm probably going to start with 4 or so. And we are really intending in these seminars to look deeply at the missional work of the church, and then some very practical things that churches and faith communities can do to alter things in their communities like zoning laws or to counter things like not in my backyard, and then some very practical ideas about how churches might be able to use their property to build housing and to do other kinds of things which can enhance their communities. This gathering was planned by a team that included William Wilkinson, who is the pastor at Medina Church and Presbyterian Church in Medina, and you'll hear from him in a little while. And Dr. Violet Lee, who's the executive program minister at Christ Church. Dan DeBrucker, who's a seminarian. Where are you, Dan? Back here. At Union Theological, and then Heather Kirk Davidoff, who is our coordinator for this effort, and she's also on our team, and I'm really grateful to her for all of her expertise. And I really want to say our time together is made possible by some very generous donations, and I'd like to thank the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church for their support, and Marty Swartzwell, who's on our board, is also United Methodist and part of, I think, the granting body for that. And then also Goldstein Hall Attorneys at Law, and they've also pledged their support for regional conferences. And they have, what's more, donated the food tonight. So thank you. It's great. So we just love working with Goldstein Hall. They're one of the best groups of people to really help churches think through the legal questions they need to be dealing with at the beginning stages of development. So we're really pleased to have them as partners. And then also Union Theological Seminary donated space tonight, so thanks to Union. So I now want to introduce to you Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullilove and Reverend William Wilkinson, who will begin our evening with their observations and reflections. And Dr. Fullilove is a clinical psychiatrist and a professor of urban policy and health at the New School, having moved there in 2016 after 26 years at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and Columbia University. Her research examines the mental health effects of violence, segregation, and urban renewal in inner cities, communities, and she's the author of more than 100 published articles and 6 books, including Root Shock, How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America and What We Can Do About It, and Urban Alchemy, Restoring Joy in America's Sorted Out Cities. And also Reverend Dr. William Wilkinson, who currently serves as the pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Medina, New York, who's had an incredibly varied career. He's a graduate of Albert Einstein School of Medicine, as well as the Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, and has at least 3 other advanced degrees. And William serves on the board of New York State Council of Churches, and we benefited greatly from his contribution and leadership, and he indeed brought us to Mindy, who he has known for many years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mindy.
So it's a great pleasure that you all came out on this rainy night. Rainy, windy, cold. Good night to stay home and have tea. Yet here you are. So I think my goal is not to make you too depressed. You came out on a rainy, windy night. But I really want to talk about depressing stuff. So with your permission. I want to talk about social disintegration, which is, as a psychiatrist, the diagnosis I would make of the United States of America. When we think about what did it take to win World War II, what did it take to do D-Day, What did it take to wipe out polio in our nation? It took the ability to work together. And it's interesting because there was segregation, yet there was some sense that we were in this together. People pulled together. That has been destroyed. And what I want to talk about is what does that look like when it's destroyed, and then how did we get there? What did we do to ourselves? That this is a process of self-mutilation. Nobody did it to us. We did it to ourselves as a nation. And that's what I want to talk about, because I think that your project is fundamental to helping us repair what has to be repaired. So the great physician, anthropologist Alexander Leighton is the one who really established, he's a social psychiatrist, really established this concept of social disintegration. And these are the things that he talked about. In places that are socially disintegrated, you have a high frequency of broken homes, few and weak associations, few and weak leaders, few patterns of recreation, high frequency of hostility, high frequency of crime and delinquency, and weak and fragmented networks of communication. So I want you to keep those in mind as we go forward. I want to talk about basically I want to put forward this concept of root shock. How do we tear up a neighborhood? And then related to how do we tear up our nation? So the opposite of social disintegration is integration. And when they started to do a really foundational study on this process, looking at the relationship between social disintegration and mental health, they went to a place called Stirling County in Canada, and they compared communities that they said, based on those factors, were disintegrated or integrated. And so this is a photograph of a Sunday school class in an integrated community. This is a really important and classic photo, and I'd just like to pause and ask you what you see that might represent integration. Integration not in the sense of racial integration, but integration in the sense of social bonds, strong social bonds. What do you see?
You're looking at each other. Hard.
You're all really engaged.
The notion that, right, at least to me it looks like there's a child that's sort of doing the teaching to a certain level. I mean, that right, it's not just teachers and all these sort of people that don't have so much power. Right?
It's kind of among them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of esteem between them, a lot of, especially the children. Looking at her, there's a relationship that you can see in their faces with her.
And they esteem her, and she esteems them.
Yes.
Yeah. What's the mood in the room, would you say? If you walked into the room, right at that moment, what would you expect to feel?
I see attentiveness. I think they're really listening to each other.
Openness.
And what would that feel like to you? Feel good? There's a lot of trust. And trust feels good to us, right? So, this is the same thing in a different setting. So this is art class at the Irene Kaufman Settlement House, later called Hill House, in the Hill District in Pittsburgh in the 1950s, part of a photograph as part of the Pittsburgh Photographic Project. What do you see in this picture that's the same?
Concentration, attentiveness.
Purpose.
Yeah.
A similar attitude or a similar feeling of mutual regard and self-regard as they're all engaged in something.
There's also a feeling of safety and calm.
I was really hoping that you would say that. Safety.
Yeah.
Not use
Calm.
something else, but safety is, I think there's a real feeling in both these photographs of safety. You know Maslow's hierarchy? You have to get pretty far up the hierarchy before you can learn. But in these two photographs, there's real learning going on. Because the children feel safe. They feel safe because they're esteemed, they're respected, they're listened to, they're connected, there are bonds, and so we get the possibility for learning. And these children are learning. The whole point of social integration, from the perspective of social psychiatry, is to create that. That's our goal. Because then children can learn. And if children can learn, then they grow up to be able to they can be problem solvers. And learning and problem solving are the two keys to adaptive living. And it's all about adaptive living because times are changing. Times are always changing rapidly. Right now they happen to be changing at a speed almost beyond our comprehension. So if we haven't created that, in every classroom in the nation we're falling short. But we also can create the opposite. We can create social disintegration. So I want you to keep it. Everybody got this imprinted? You got it? So Pittsburgh was segregated. This is a map from 1930. So the gray areas are the black segregated areas. And if you look where that red circle is, that's what's called the Lower Hill. And that's the sort of tight, dense streets of the Lower Hill. And this is what it looks like in a photograph. So it was a busy, active place. We know this because the great African-American photographer Charles T. Harris took 80,000 or some number of photographs of it, all of which are in the Carnegie Museum of Art, and which show the incredible number of activities and organizations and people going about their lives in this neighborhood. People often say, oh, black people look back at the neighborhoods in the 50s and it's just nostalgia, it really wasn't that good. But there's actually a huge body of photographic evidence that supports people's memories that these neighborhoods that became the targets of urban renewal were very powerful neighborhoods. In the sense of this is the holding community in which that art class can take place. So whatever's going on these streets, it creates the possibility of that. And this, the Iron City Lodge, number 17. I always like to give my students the assignment of looking at this photograph and thinking about how many organizations did it take to create that photograph. It's a thought exercise, I don't know how many. But if I give you that exercise, how many organizations does it take to create that photograph? We could list what's one that you think of. Obviously, Iron City Lodge, number 17. VPOEW. But what are some other organizations that it takes to create this?
Music teachers and
Music teachers.
practice places.
Practice places. What else? That's a good thought exercise, right? I mean, you take it for granted, a band. Any of you ever tried to start a band?
Family stability.
There's a band. The building is one of the Carnegie libraries in Pittsburgh, which is now no longer a Carnegie Library.
And these families also had a setting where these kids could take lessons, rehearse, practice.
Yes. But what else?
There's people that want to show up to.
Yes, there's an audience. Yeah, really important, right? Yeah. But what else do you have to have?
Perhaps high school students?
Some of these it seems like people of different ages, but yeah, perhaps high school students, in which case you have to have a high school. These people have outfits.
Yeah.
So that is a whole different, other set of people, right?
Right.
So, take this thought experiment home with you, and over the next few days, try to think how many organizations does it take to create a marching band? It's not overnight. It's not easy. So, this is, and Mr. Harris, the photographer, had the nickname One Shot because he would go someplace like that and take one photograph. So, remember, this is the days before cell phones. So when you took 40,000 photographs, he was a newspaper photographer, so they were of events. President Roosevelt came to town, he took one photograph. So there are 40,000 shots of life in the Hill District. Are you following me? That's a lot of life.
Yeah.
Richard Saunders was my next door neighbor and was also part of the Pittsburgh Photographic Project. Just a picture of kids on the street waiting for the bus. And this is, I think, one of the most astounding pictures that Mr. Harris took. Because, do you know Rembrandt's picture of the guard? This is a very formal photograph of the men of the hill. And look how dignified. And again, just as with the children in the nursery school, you see that trust, you see safety, you see calm, you see esteem, you see respect. This is on the sidewalk. And you also see competition. That guy over there, I always think he must have been probably the most serious checkers player. Very serious move to them. Now, nobody plays checkers anymore, do they? Does anybody play checkers anymore? It's like a lost game, right? But it was a very important game in the Black Belt in the South that people brought north with them. So this is, in a way, a picture of heritage, African American heritage. It's the night watch that Rembrandt painted so majestically, and this, I think, is the equivalent. This is integration. So Stanley Crouch said this collection provides us with an epic sense of life, which is to say that a civilization and how it worked is laid out before us. If you ever know somebody who needs to study racism in the United States, they should first study this archive. Because a lot of racism, which is the lie that black people couldn't accomplish anything, that they had no skills, that they were shiftless and lazy. You have to see these photographs. So urban renewal is one of a long series of assaults on those neighborhoods, those African American neighborhoods, of which the Hill District here is serving as the example. So there were 2,500 projects carried out in 1,000 cities. African Americans said urban renewal is Negro removal, and actually, in point of fact, 75% of the people displaced were people of color, and 63% were African Americans. So they were absolutely right that projects were directed at them, possibly, therefore, 1,600 projects were directed at African American immigrants. These are the men who made the plans. I like that guy.
Yeah.
Looks like he's like, I'm going to talk to you later. And they made the urban renewal plan because Edgar Kaufman, the department store magnate, the one who created Falling Water, wanted an outdoor setting for light opera. He liked light opera. And if you look at this picture carefully, there are about 4 African Americans in this picture. So the African American neighborhood was bulldozed to create a setting for light opera for the white community, which is very bitter, isn't it? Not even for their daily use, but for their entertainment. And so this is what the plan looked like, the dense buildings of the lower hill. They were going to put in a set of highways and parking lots, and the round thing is the Civic Arena, which is where Mr. Kaufman would hear the light opera. That's what it looked like after it was done. And this is how you destroy a city. Right? There was no requirement, there was no call that they go in and do this. But they said it was a blighted slum. And the photographic evidence is that's not true. needed some investment, but there couldn't be investment there because of redlining. So, what is root shock? So this is my neighbor, Richard Saunders' photograph of this woman being moved out of her apartment. They're tearing down a building to create some public housing. And the distress in her face is the distress of root shock. I was stunned to find the exact same picture that was drawn in Paris during the Haussmann's renovations of the Center of Paris, which you can see in my book, Root Shock, the two photographs. It's stunning. It's the exact same look. So 2 continents, 100 years apart, the same experience of terror and pain. It's like, I don't want to move. And that's the demolition that they were making. So I defined root shock after, traveling around and studying urban renewal in a number of cities as the traumatic stress reaction to the loss of all or part of one's emotional ecosystem. Notice that this has nothing to do with it being caused by urban renewal, has nothing to do with it being urban, has nothing to do with it being American, and it has nothing to do necessarily with it being the built environment. So if you've been reading about the cyclone in Africa and the terrible devastation, that's root shock. If you've been living through this growing awareness that we no longer have the climate we used to have, that's root shock. If you've been trying to learn how to manage your cell phone, for which purpose grandchildren were invented, it's root shock, right? We used to just push the little dial. That's all you had to do. So root shock is not confined by anything other than it's the loss of all or part of one's emotional ecosystem. Emotional in the sense that is what you're bonded to. The thought is you can do that to black people and everything will be fine. But it's not just black people who have been hit by these processes. But we need to understand that they're all the same. They're all the same in this core quality of the denigration of humanity. So that's our project. And the People's Observance that we've called for is October 12th to 18th of this year. And many organizations are going to be responding. It's our hope and our prayer that on October 13th there'll be, we're trying to convince Union and Riverside Church that they should be the hosts of a solemn occasion, which would be a great festival. So if you know anybody at either of those places, tell them this would be a great idea. You should do it. But lots of places are going to be doing things. I heard from a friend of mine that Carnegie Hall is very serious. They're thinking what they're going to do. And Brooklyn Historical Society is thinking what they're going to do. So there are in this, as I said, I keep saying there's a series. One of the series, this is artist Carlos Peterson's view of disinvestment. So not only was the lower part of the hill bulldozed, but then all of the hill was disinvested by the city. Many, all across the whole nation, many black, Latin, and working class neighborhoods have been disinvested, meaning that public resources were pulled out, followed by private resources. So fire stations were closed, police stations were closed, schools were closed, banks were closed, groceries were closed. People, you will often hear, and you have perhaps said yourself, that such and such a place is a food desert. It's never a food desert first. Food desert is pretty deep into disinvestment. Because everybody's got to buy food. So some little place to buy food survives for a long time. It's not the first place to go. So if you've gotten to the point of a food desert, it's also a book desert, it's a school desert. So disinvestment, which we've been doing for decades, has been another very deliberate, very public policy of destruction. There's a new movie, which I urge you all to see, called Decade of Fire, about the burning of the Bronx. I see our man from the Bronx is here. It's quite a moving film. Another one of Carlos Peterson's drawings, and you've seen this if you've been to a neighborhood that's had its resources withdrawn. When there's no money to fix the buildings, they sag in exactly this way. And this is the photograph of the hill under the effects of disinvestment. So what do you see in this photograph?
I used to work in West Philly. That's West Philly.
He said he used to work in West Philly. In fact, West Philly looks like that. But what do you see that you say, oh, I've seen that before? It's also the South Bronx, it's also Newark, it's also a lot of places, right? But what do you see?
Vacant lots.
Vacant lots. Trash. A lot of trash, right?
People are just walking one by one, isolated.
Yeah. Would you set up a checker game outside one of those spots? You wouldn't, because this is a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and she fills it with competitions for territory. When you break the social structure, when you break the physical structure, this is when you create violence and hatred and a community. The little pieces of the community that are left turn against one another. It's not safe to be in the streets anymore. And the families are broken into little pieces. And it's no longer a whole neighborhood creating safety for all the children. It's a single mother trying to keep her kids from being shot. So this is an incomplete list, but these are some of the things that are undermining neighborhoods in our nation. Racial segregation, redlining, urban renewal, highway construction, catastrophic disinvestment, deindustrialization, the war on drugs and mass incarceration, the destruction of housing projects, gentrification, the subprime looting crisis, and now extreme weather. So it is not just urban neighborhoods that have been hit by these things. If you think about agribusiness eating up family farms and destroying rural neighborhoods, it's the same thing. If you think about any city that had industry that has now gone through deindustrialization, it's the same thing. One or another of these things has hit every part of our country. Now, some parts of our country are so-called prospering. We have the Rust Belt, and then we have the Sun Belt. But it is as jarring to have your population double as it is to have your population collapse. So the Sun Belt suffers from success, and the Rust Belt suffers from failure. So, for example, in the rural areas, black and white, where there are very few resources, where the family farms have fallen apart, the social organization has fallen apart, the towns have shrunk, there's huge drug epidemics. Why are there huge drug epidemics? For the same reason that there have been huge drug epidemics in the inner city, because there's not another economy. The agricultural economy, the industrial economy have both been destroyed. And now the retail economy is shifting wildly, but basically shifting to be online, which involves very few jobs, or many fewer jobs than when people work in stores. People have made the point that of how many people it took to work at Kodak and Polaroid, and how many people it now takes for us to all have our photos. We have thousands, billions of more photos, but it doesn't take any people, or like a very tiny percentage of the people, to be behind all that. So we propose this, what we call a stage-state model of community collapse, thinking about what happens to neighborhoods or cities if you hit them over and over and over again. So what happens if you have urban renewal in the 1950s, and then you have deindustrialization in the 1960s and 70s, and then you have disinvestment in the 1980s, then you have crack epidemics and violence epidemics, and then you have gentrification, what has happened to the neighborhoods that have been jarred, that have been torn apart, that have lost part of their physical foundation. And what we have found is that they slowly fall apart. They don't fall apart all at once. So urban renewal is hard, but neighborhoods try to come back. But urban renewal plus deindustrialization, so knocking out the social foundation and the economic foundation, neighborhoods still try to come back, but it gets harder and harder and harder. And you have fewer people, and the people are sicker, and people have fewer resources. So what you create is real and widespread social disintegration. Leighton and others who were the students of social disintegration around the time of World War II said that they thought that there are two things that happen under those conditions, either religious fanaticism or fascism. So it's not a good thing to do to your country, to tear it apart in this way. And so the issue is how do you start to rebuild? But there was an article in the paper the other day about new diseases in Los Angeles. Terrible homeless population living under horrible conditions. And so they have diseases that we haven't seen since the medieval times. So diseases like typhus, which as a physician I've never seen typhus. All of a sudden typhus is back because we have people living under bridges, terrible conditions. So the work that you're called to do is the work of rebuilding. This has to be rebuilt if we are to avoid some version of fanaticism. Obviously, we're very vulnerable to fanaticism. And if we are to avoid even more crazy versions of fanaticism, we have to put this thing back together. We have to mend the physical and the social fracture. So, one of the tools that I want to put before you, because it's like a one-shot deal. You know those advertisements like, call now, this deal won't last. Is that 2019 is the 400th anniversary of the first Africans landing at Jamestown. And I'm part of a project called 400 Years of Inequality, which has called on people to pause to observe this anniversary. And we've posted as 400 Years of Inequality. So people all over the country, organizations, small and large, will be observing this. And I hope that all of your organizations will as well. It's 400 years, right? That deserves a pause. We need to put a pin in it, as they say, and think about this and honor all those people. And it's quite a moment of meeting, because the Africans were brought over to work on plantations, and women were being brought over to be sold as sex slaves. It's a wild and crazy scene. And it's this Lord of the Flies moment where the real roots of what we're in today, sort of we're fighting our Lord of the Flies side and our more civilized side, the side that can produce great neighborhoods, great people, great achievements, and our real ability to rob and tear and steal and denigrate. And as Abraham Lincoln said, we're fighting now to determine if this nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. Maybe climate change will wipe us out. So thanks for your attention.
Dr. Wilkinson, I'll invite you to come forward and offer a theological response. How does that sound? So, a theological and pastoral response.
Participation is emancipatory and empowering. They say that you have to have an attitude that questions the status quo. And then you have to look to where the problem seems to be. You have to investigate, and then you finally have to be actively creating a different way of being and acting in the world. So for me, the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, That is looking at the problem in the world and questioning the status quo. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are all those blesseds. These people are hearing Jesus of Nazareth talk about them. Now Luke, of course, said, yeah, but Matthew, you like those, you like that old hierarchical stuff. So I'm going to say that Jesus said this on the plane. So to speak plainly, it's all about looking and seeing what's the status quo, what's wrong, and then saying that it's got to be something different. And after just saying a few more things about who we are, who we might be, and Matthew's book gets to his chapter 7. And in chapter 7, Matthew says, well, first, don't judge. And then says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But most powerfully he says, and in this is the whole law and the prophets. The whole law. And what that means is, people can't just pick the part of the Bible that they want to pick and just get rid of folks and say the in-group and out-group. That there are places in the Christian faith, in that Bible, where this idea of connectedness is laid out. Now the problem is that our general theology has not taken the time to say it's all of us. In fact, we spend a lot of time saying it's only the ones who are saved, kind of thing. When if you listen to Jesus of Nazareth, you finally have to develop a perspective that makes a choice. Gibran, the Christian Lebanese American, says that in Lebanon there's a Christian myth that the two Jesus, and he says there are two, they meet every 100 years in the hills of Lebanon, and they lovingly discuss from sun up to sundown so many things. But as he turns to leave, Jesus of Nazareth says to Jesus of the Christians, my dear brother, I love you so, but I do not think we will ever agree. So root theology really resonated with me, and I said, okay, root theology. So we got the idea of the roots. We need to restore the roots. We need to grow the roots. How do we do that? Well, let's take the word root. First, you have to have a radical look at your faith. You've got to look at those pieces of your faith that speak to relationship, that speak to people's experiences. And we have that, right? The Shema, right? The love of God in your hearts, in your heads, and your wrists. And Jeremiah repeats it. He said, the new covenant is it'll all be there. It'll be inside you. And then you have to have the radicals that are the confessions and the testaments of people who on their best days were really talking about this integral relationship that people have, just like these trees and plants have. As you get to that, you begin to think that, oh, there are other kinds of radicals around. The Charter for Compassion from 2009. You see, because it's time for people of faith to realize that all human beings are people of faith. Some of us call it religion, some of us call it spirituality, some of us call it humanity, but it's all the same spiritual human reality. Okay, so we look at all these pieces that are around us for what are the root, radical, growing things that we can use to nourish ourselves, and then we have that O. That the R-O is oikumenos. Now, we people of the church, we think, oh, we got that. You're talking about ecumenical. A bunch of people that disagree on some things, get together and they do good stuff. But that is only a limited view of ecumenical. Even if you look at ecumenical as, well, ecumenically ecumenical. That means people of all faiths, interfaith. The word oikos means the household. The oikumenos is the whole household of God, not denominations, not religions, not little narrow definitions. So whatever we do in terms of responding to this root shock, we have to do it with the whole humankind as God's humankind. Doesn't matter if you believe, and you don't have to call it God. You as an individual saying, for me, I'm doing it because it's God, I think, that relates us all. But we're all related. Now, that second O, that's the tough one. This is the one that challenges people in congregations who want to do good stuff, because that is opting. Some people call it opting for the poor. But it's opting to stand with the poor, opting to stand with whoever is hard-pressed and marginalized. And then it means becoming vulnerable. Becoming vulnerable. Because your friends aren't going to like you because you're standing with those people that are strangers. Why are you standing there? Why are you giving them money? Why are you selling their houses? Why are you renting to them? And all the other stuff. All right, so that means that you have to get down to brass tacks. If you are a farmer and you're going to grow things with new roots, you have to make a transition. You either have to dig up the ground, water the ground, take up stones. You got to do something that's different. You have to be in a new kind of a process, and that process of transition becomes transactional, relational, and finally transformational. And of course, a good Presbyterian who was given a talk here would say, if I'm transformed, I'm always being transformed and always transforming. So where that root theology gets you to is the challenge of this interconnectedness. Now, there are two concepts I want to give to you that are not new, they're not mine, but they are so rich. First is that Bonhoeffer, who worked here and walked these streets and learned so much from Clayton Powell that he took the spirituals back in the basements of the church when Hitler's Nazis came. He said, I'm going to make some Jews in the German Secret Service and I'll send them across the border. He said, there is no such thing as PhD thesis as an individual. There are only socio-individuals. You and I are not individuals. Not only that, Freire, who is very important to the fashioning of root theology, Freire said, transformation cannot take place in an individual. It is a collective process. A collective process. So the theological response to Dr. Fullilove is we have to be using the theology that we have that is telling us of the interconnectedness, the interrelatedness. We've got to become vulnerable, and we have got to take risks. If we don't do that, here's the problem. A little participation looks good, but it reinforces what's happening now.
If I could have William and Mindy come and stand here, that would be great. So this is going to be a time for some conversation. The big reason that the New York State Council churches got into the whole conversation about bridging the urban-rural divide, and we did 2 conferences on this. And we often try to say that when churches think about ministry, faith communities think about ministry, we want them to think about their parish. And the parish is not what's just in your 4 walls. The parish is your neighborhood. The parish is your little rural community. Your parish is the county. It's the whole fabric of where your faith community is called to serve. And all of those people there are your parishioners, whether they ever come to your church or not. And so what we really want to do is help churches to think about their parish and then how it is that they can take very practical steps to make changes in their community, like changes in zoning laws, or really trying to counter not in my backyard tendencies, which you could have all the money in the world to build affordable housing, and you try to site it in a community and it's like, not in my backyard. We don't want this here. And then thinking in very practical ways about how one can use one's building to extend your mission. And that could mean building affordable housing, but it could be about a community center. It could be about thinking carefully how to build up the fabric of the community and how you can use your property and your assets to be able to do that, to fulfill what God has called you to do. So that's what we're here to try to think about. And what we know is that as we begin that process, churches have to think deeply about their mission. They have to go into this for the right reasons. And developers are going to tell you that. Attorneys are going to tell you that. They speak from experience, because if churches go into this for the wrong reasons, they end up not always in a very good space. So that's why we really want to spend the time to think carefully about what is our mission and why we do what we do, before we just sort of react to something or jump at something or become an inadvertent agent of displacement. So that's kind of what brought us here. But how do we get back to that kind of a community of interconnectedness in, say, parts of New York City where there is a real breakdown, the kind of community that you've talked about, or in our rural communities?
Well, obviously it's a process, and it's a long process. But one of the reasons that I've been part of this call for this observance is that we have to understand this history of destruction, because otherwise we blame people. And actually, the Decade of Fire is a great example of what we think. If we just say, "I have a story," or there's a question. So Vivian, who made the movie, had a question. Well, what happened to the Bronx? She grew up there. She watched it burn down. But what happened? And she goes on this exploration, and then she shares the story as she uncovered it. But it's quite beautiful and quite remarkable. All of us have such stories. We've seen something happen. We're puzzled by it. We don't really understand. And this year, 2019, is a moment to say, let me learn a little bit more. It may take you years. It may take you 5 minutes to find out, to satisfy yourself. But it's that pause. Let me try to understand the story that I'm part of. Because otherwise we would just move out from the wrong, as you said, the wrong ideas. I think that churches know how to build community, which is why churches are so important to this. So churches have spaces. Churches know how to invite people in. Churches know how to inspire. And so that's what this is about going forward. I'm a fan of Michael Mather of Broadway Methodist Church in Indianapolis, who decided that he would shift he and his congregation decided they would shift from providing services to doing asset-based community development. And they've done just teaching us that we have to look for people's assets. And then we have to support them. Like, find out somebody is good at baking cakes and says, could you bake a cake for us? Here's some money, bake a cake. And then when the person proves they really can bake a cake, then help them have a cake business. So I think but that's a tool of a church, right? That's the process of discovery of the church, and a wonderful story. So that's what I think. It's long, but start with the history. Don't let this moment go by without reflecting on your piece of this journey in these 400 years. What parts of it have you seen that maybe nobody else has?
Could you say a little bit about urban alchemy, about the periodic elements as one way of sort of
how we put them back together? And from my visits in France and around the United States, of people who were trying to put things back together. So I call these the elements of urban restoration. And the book is about 9 elements of urban restoration that we found in these various places. So there are certainly a lot of tools, and Lynn will sell you a copy of Urban Alchemy.
On the way here today on the train, I was thinking about your 9 elements, and I thought, now why did Bindi choose to have a periodic table of these elements of restoration? Why did Bindi choose elements? Oh, I said, oh my gosh, she's saying that these elements are essential. They exist beyond my describing them. I'm merely describing the real tools we have.
Not that I would want you to go through all 9 points, but could you give me an example of a couple of them?
And we aren't saying there are only 9.
Right.
But 9 that people want to add others that are, but truly elements, things that people do. And I didn't invent them. They're things I saw multiple groups doing. They're things people do that I thought are things that people do to put things back together. So the first 3 are what we call align. The second part are create. And the third part are connect. And if you think about align, create, connect, it's a very archetypal process of recovery. So if you think about for example, the 12 steps. The 12 steps are 1 to 3, aligning your will with God's will. 4 to 9, creating a new way of being in the world. And then 10 through 12, connecting with others. So this is very archetypal, you find it everywhere. So the 3 elements of align, the first is city in mind. That we tend to, for example, blame neighborhoods. So Harlem is a bad neighborhood, or the Hill District is a bad neighborhood. And you can only solve the problems of a neighborhood if you have the city in mind. So you work in a neighborhood, but with the city in mind. So that's the first. The second of the align elements is find what you're for. That we can't work from what we're against. We have to work from our vision. Stephen Covey said, start with the end in mind. What's our vision? What are we going towards? And then the third of the align elements completely slipped my mind at this moment. And let's make a mark.
Instead of going through.
Let's make a mark.
Okay, right.
Yeah. Which is to begin to express what you're thinking in the world. Start to show the world. So there could be something simple, like, in the Hill District, they wanted to stop more destruction and fight for affordable housing, so they put up a billboard, a very famous billboard in the history there. So those are 3. Those sound familiar, right? You're like, yeah, I do that. Yeah, that's the point. You do that. You already know that.
But Freire would say, if he was sitting here, you must be consistent. The problem is that at least we Christians, we say it on Sunday, and then forget about it on Monday. Too often. So consistency with those, using the elements over and over and over again.
So I'm going to open it up now for lots of probing questions here. So I'm going to give Jason LeBay from Goldstein Hall first question. So,
thanks. Article earlier this week, I guess it was, in Crane's talking about the struggles that churches are facing in Harlem. Some having been lost in bad development deals, some not being able to keep up with their buildings, some taking advantage of the booming real estate market to either sell and leave or have a new sanctuary and community space built and either affordable or frequently the pressures are market rate housing above. And so I wanted to take this to sort of a very, the attorney in the room, so forgive me for taking it to the very pedestrian. But I wanted to take sort of what this discussion is and maybe map it down to the specific instance of Harlem and what Harlem is facing right now in terms of, I don't know if you want to call it at once economic disinvestment over time, but now sort of opportunistic development that is displacing a lot of the historical neighborhoods, groups, individuals, socio-individuals at once. So, how does one wrestle with that? And then churches being both actor, object and subject, being acted upon and having the opportunity to act, what ought they do? Right?
And part of our work was really to map this process. In fact, our stage-state model of community disintegration was drawn from our observations of Harlem. And so Harlem in the 1950s had much in common with the Hill District in Pittsburgh, but then went through this long series of assaults. In Harlem, McCarthyism was a very big actor, because McCarthyism destroyed the progressive, most radical part of the political position and left much more accommodationist politicians in power. So just as black people were beginning to have political power, it wasn't the radical ones who were for the people, it was the other ones. So McCarthyism played a big role. And that's followed then by all these other things, of urban renewal and deindustrialization, epidemics that were never managed as they should have been. Then you get into land shrinkage, which wipes out a third of Harlem's population and half of its housing stock. So those are horrific assaults on the integrity of the community. And Harlem is by the time this is going on, and then crack comes in, the AIDS epidemic comes in, the violence epidemic comes in, and the neighborhood is reeling. I was driving down the street with the guy who was then the head of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, going to Harlem Hospital, and there was a guy on the street who was standing on the street, and there was a store right there. And the guy looks at us, we were in a car, and he looks at us and he said, "Did you see that rat? It was that big." And there was a rat just limping around in the back of the store, because everything was out of control, including the rats. So when you lost half the population and you lost this economic support, families fell apart. So 72% of the families in Harlem were headed by two parents in 1950, but by 1990 it was only 16%. The churches fell apart. So Harlem was black people are the most highly churched people in the United States, but the churches had all fallen apart. Their parishioners were coming in from outside the neighborhood. So the community was fractured, it was impoverished, it was reeling, it was disoriented, and it had leadership that was very ambivalent about being, it was very ambivalent about being for the people. So what were the churches to do? The churches were pretty much the same as the other leaders. They weren't radical. There were no... Jesus of Nazareth was not in Harlem in the 1990s, over the last 25 years. He was in another city. And that other guy,
mm-hmm.
Jesus of
the Christians,
was there. So what is a church to do? And what is any of us to do, right? The part of this is that we're going into an era in world history of horrors that we've never seen before. We're going into the how many plagues were there? Seven. We're going into the 7 plagues. And why? Because Pharaoh would not let my people go, so to speak. So, what happened in Africa, the cyclone, unbelievable. Same thing happened in the Midwest, right? In Nebraska. So, and we're going into this not together, but divided. Mm-hmm. We're so divided, not only around the world, but in the United States. We are not in good shape. So what should any of us do? I think everybody has to sit with this history. Then start to say, we're not going to keep doing that.
So just applying to Harlem, what we're trying to do in Medina, and what we've been doing in Rochester with criminal justice, the churches need to understand that there's only one church. If you're a Christian, there's only one church. It's everybody. So then they need to look at their neighbor churches and other institutions who they've done other things with and say, I need you to be with me on this journey. They've got to think about, well, do we exist as all separate churches, or do some of us need to come together and combine? Do we need to have 3 housing developments? Or do we decide that we're going to have 1 housing development, but next time around you're going to lead us in the school issue, so that they begin to work interconnectedly. What Mindy would say is they've got to choose what they're for. But it's not an individual choice. They've got to really build the relationship. Now, one response of faith organizations is the whole phenomenon of congregation-based community organizing. The PICO Foundation, and the Gamaliel Foundation, and the Industrial Areas Foundation, all of them doing the similar kinds of things with a different sort of relationship base. And what that's about is building relationships within congregations and between congregations. Those organizations, when they have local chapters, they have to have at least 5 or 10 churches to join that. And when they choose a community issue, they choose what they're for, and they work together on that. Some of the folks that are facing this stuff in Harlem need to be asking themselves, let me be vulnerable to my colleagues, my sister churches, and with them take the picture. You know, how Dr. Mindy was doing the pictures? Well, Furry would say, you guys got all these cameras, and you have all this technology, use it to look at, in a different way, what is your reality? What's the fuller picture? And if you need help from the outside, get that. But together, you can then begin to articulate what your story is and have a collective response to it. It may not look the same, right? The old roots may not look the same as the new roots.
So I'm looking around, and I just remind ourselves that we are right on the edge of Harlem, right here. And for those, are there people in the room who might also have a reflection on response to Jason's question about what's happening in Harlem right now and what's either working or getting in the way of doing the kind of inclusive community that we're talking about?
Yeah, I saw the article as well. And, maybe I had a different read on it, because all of what the article kind of describes as dysfunctional, I think has been perfectly functional in terms of the deconstruction of a community longitudinally. And the same pattern has emerged over and over again. When the pictures were put up, I think what was kind of very, very apparent but not very visible was the role of religion versus religiosity. And I think that religion was a possession of the community. In Harlem and in many other communities, it's been switched, where the community is now possession of religion or religiosity. And the building is coming from that perspective. As you saw the erosion of the community in Pittsburgh, and it parallels just some. I grew up on the Lower East Side, and we saw some of the same images. Where we had images of people playing checkers on the street. There was the churches were a possession of the community, and you related to different churches for different things. You went to St. Mary's, St. Teresa's for bingo. You went to DeWitt Reformed Church for youth stuff. You went to settlement houses. But it was clear who the churches belonged to, and that there was a certain fabric in the community. I think with the erosion, you not only had an abandonment of people, but you then had a growth of churches. As the Bronx was being burned, I was working for a state assemblyman when I was chief of staff, so we rode the streets all the time. And where commerce was leaving, churches were prospering in those storefronts. And you no longer had economic commerce, but you had religiosity and religious commerce that was kind of lording over in these places, in these spaces. And I think if we cannot switch that paradigm, and maybe we feel a little bit too good about ourselves and a little bit too bold about our mission. But I think that we need to surrender in order to get a different take on what appears to be dysfunction, if you're looking at it through the lens of the church, that is eroding, and perfect function in terms of the displacement of a people historically over and over and over again. And if we don't get it, we will have the same challenges, for the next few generations, and maybe 800 years from now. We will be commemorating some of the same things and the same patterns. So I think that community organizing becomes critical, and the church having to take a less conspicuous role in that and come more organically out of that community organizing, and then set up those scenarios where there is peaceful space based upon the values and the theology that is asserted by the church, with the young girls appearing to be in a Sunday school class, or the boys who are painting appearing to be in a settlement house. So I think that article in Cranes, for me, it was very, very enlightening and illuminating, but it also, in my mind, was very, very distracting, because it's pointing people's minds away from what the problem actually is. The buildings that these churches are possessing are not the buildings that those churches built. And so they are in possession of a problem in the same way that in areas of South Carolina, it was one of the few places along the coast where the plantation owners abandoned the plantations. And so you then had the development of some healthy black communities until around World War II, and you had the public works programs that built bridges over to places like St. Helena's and other islands. And the islands were rediscovered, and then the coastal law was superimposed on those islands. The basic behavior, like playing checkers out on the street, became criminalized. And the basic existence of people, black people, in a community became criminalized. And before you knew it, you had a gentrification and a claiming of these most beautiful beaches along the Atlantic coast, and the blacks who had been first abandoned with the emancipation, then being shifted and shuttled over to the coastal towns, into those urban areas of poverty and blight. So it's a similar pattern, and Harlem is, I think, undergoing that same thing. And I'll finish with this, because the role of the church is critical. I served on the board of Interfaith Adoptability in the early 80s. And it was an advocacy organization. It got into the business of real estate development because it was opportunistic. There was so much abandonment. And the churches went from being advocates to landlords. And the way that we then looked at the people that we advocated for became very, very different, because when they couldn't pay rent, it was easy to advocate for them in the court. When they didn't pay rent, when we had developed those properties, we wanted them out. And it became very, very enlightening, and a real inward look within the faith community, the religious communities, to see what our role may be in the larger complicity of this problem. If we can identify that, I think we can start to, if not reverse it, at least slow it down.
One of the things you said makes me think of Paulo Freire. The core of his book is based in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 13. Faith, hope, and love. That's how he organizes it. And why he did it was because he had a Catholic country, and he was going to be educating folks, and so he used their values to then talk to them in an interactional, dialogic way about what's your story. And, his concept of conscientious desire. You think about something until you understand it, and you move then to change it. So the churches here, instead of thinking they have the values inside the building, use their values to go outside the building and then with the people look at where their common ground values are. This is why the Charter for Compassion can be so important. It's not doctrinal. It's based in human connectedness and commonality, the golden rule. So getting outside the churches and looking at what is the story of the people around you. This is where Mindy's book, Urban Alchemy, becomes very, very important, because the whole thing is looking at the elements that are amongst the people already, their ability to be encouraged to look at their own reality. And if they look in the hard enough, they're going to want to change that reality because they understand it more, not by the story that someone told them is their reality, but what they actually see.
It's really a problem. So when communities are torn apart, people recrystallize in small groups that hate each other. And they crystallize around what are called, in sociology, strong ties, one of which is religion. So the churches, your point that they go from being a part of the community to being this religiosity. If we may say that if we may use your term religiosity, describes these warring little fragments. So alignment is about bringing those, opening up the hostility among those fragments and helping them get on the same page. And that's what alignment is about. That's what the first three elements of Urban Alchemy, those are the tools people use. That you have to see that there's a bigger picture here, that people have to get together and find what they're for, and then they have to start to express it. So we did some work in a neighborhood in Philadelphia named Eastwick, and using those principles, they were doing some planning for the neighborhood, and there were two warring factions, and they were quite at war. The first community meeting, a whole bunch of people came in just to disrupt the meeting. But when we did the second alignment session where we talked about what are you for, and people shared their values. There was no difference in the values. They wanted their neighbors to know them. They wanted to live in a peaceful place. They wanted to have secure homes. They wanted their children to be educated. It was remarkable. Everybody in the whole room had the same values. And by the end, the two groups had come together. But like behind the scenes, not in the public process. They on their own, set each other down and said, we got to work this out. So alignment is a real thing. And the fracture, which shows up as churches not working together, people not working together, it shows up as gang violence in the street, it shows up a lot of ways. It's the alignment process that helps us bring that back together.
There were a lot of cohesive practices that at least nominally were imposed on the community. As part of the rezoning, the Department of City Planning has designed charrettes. And they will go and solicit community-based organizations, I think they were all secular, to convene the neighborhood, the residents there, so that there can be a voice for the people up, and then integrate it into this governmental process. And then a part of the work of the community board is to keep track of the commitments that were made, and I don't know if this is the right time to hand it out. But, okay.
Welcome to pass the paper.
Okay.
We're not.
Right.
Yeah.
So there were commitments that were negotiated through the prism of community-based organizations that the city is now enjoined to deliver on. Like, you have to spend so much money to develop specific parks and things like that, and it all becomes, the people's will becomes channeled through the prism of community-based organizations. So, I think I came here tonight with a question. In my position as district manager, and through my own personal experiences in history, we are embedded in a secular tradition. And we do recognize that the faith community plays an intimate role in the community, but it's relatively easy for government, at least in my experience, to view the church as another community-based organization. And and if the church is, I don't mean to belittle it, is a community-based organization, is another nonprofit, then is there any particular and unique role that the church plays in distinction to the rest of the nonprofit community? Because it's relatively easy, it's kind of reflexive in government to reach out to community-based organizations and to solicit particular community-based organizations to try to capture or communicate with particular populations. You know, you talk to Phoenix House if you want to talk to young people with experience with drugs. You talk to Covenant House if you want to talk to, people that are runaway and things like that. What am I going to the church for?
Ooh, good one. All right. So what do you come to the church for?
Here's where the churches themselves have to be engaged in this participatory empowerment process. It's not enough for the churches to say, well, we have the strong. They have to be involved in the community organization. And see, they have a different role to play because on their best days, they're not supposed to profit. Really not. They're really not-for-profits. Not a non-profit that has money, but really a not-for-profit. And so if churches are following their root theology, then they are facilitators. Now, they may be called to lead at a certain point if the whole organizing community leadership says, no, you lead this one because this is your time to lead this one, but you're doing it with us and on our behalf, if you're our representative. But the church's real role is facilitator, is helping to do pastoral care between the people who say, well, my group's going to lead. No, my group's going to lead. We, in the criminal justice work in Rochester, I was deeply involved in all that. We have now a police we have body-worn cameras. We have a police advisory board that's about to be legislated. But behind the scenes, my role amongst these church and secular groups was doing pastoral care in the meetings, getting them to share leadership, getting them not to attack each other in emails, getting decisions to be made in the room and not, and not through emails that went public and people over there fighting. So the task of the church is you have to live into the theology. And now, as Peter said, this is your flock. The secular organizations, they're also part of your flock. So while you may have some kinds of interest for survival as an organization, you've got to handle that on the side because your real role is getting all these organizations to think community-wide. And part of the way you do that is the block involvement of the churches.
I would say that what's missing is that, which is where I think the churches should aspire to be, is the voice for the poor. The whole point of McCarthyism was to destroy the voice for the poor. Even now when people say, oh, that's socialism, it's anything that poor people need. Think about it. Housing projects that were built in the 30s and 40s were not ugly, but housing projects that were built in the 50s and 60s are all ugly. In McCarthyism, right? Because it's housing for working people. So who is the voice of the poor? And if there's no communists, no socialists, no trade union leaders, because all that got wiped out, and there's no church that steps up and says we are the voice of the poor, then who is the voice of the poor? So I think that is where all of you who are pastors should be. It's sort of, if you do it unto me, you do it unto the least. If you do it unto the least of these, you do it unto me. That you're supposed to be saying, no, that is immoral.
So, Robert,
So one of the things that I think the church's value is, this has been a group of people that have wanted to be engaged with the whole of the community. These are people who have to deal with lots of complex problems, and because they've been there for a long time, they've often outlived politicians, they've outlived policies, they've outlived destruction of their neighborhoods, and they're still there. If they're still civically engaged, they're still there as a moral voice, much like what you said with the poor. But they're trying to continue to be the values of the larger community to create a healthy community in which everybody has a part and not just certain individuals. The problem I have with developers is sometimes developers come in and they put their thing in and they're gone. They're gone to the next thing because that's the way they live. They live making money, moving on to the next thing. The churches have to stay behind. And there's churches in this city that have been here 300 years, do an incredible amount of change, and if they've been viable, they have a voice in saying, this is how we kept adapting, but this is a voice that we want to keep staying on. Whereas other groups have come and gone. Where's Pathmark? Now we have Whole Foods. And what's Whole Foods going to give to the community? Pathmark gave something different. So, the church is still there saying, yeah, but, is this a different kind of, it's no longer a food desert, it's like a whole wallet, store. We can't afford to eat here anymore. So they become a moral voice, and also with their public space, sometimes a place where the community can come to talk, where they can't find you mentioned safe spaces, where they can't find safe spaces to talk in other places. Sometimes they can barter that. And I know I've been in meetings where the church opened its doors to have a discussion that sometimes got raucous, but they allowed voices to speak that didn't find that they had a voice in other places. And I think that's sometimes what the church can help to do, and their value.
And obviously what we want to change is inequality. We're attacking the concept that some people are not fully human. So, but we have to attack this by knowing, but we have to know, Americans don't know any history. You could give a simple quiz to any 5 Americans you meet tomorrow. Like, what years was the Civil War fought? Everybody would be like, and it's just, it's useful to know what years the Civil War was fought. It wasn't in 1930. So it's sort of, these things evolved in very specific ways. And if we know those because Harlem fell apart in very specific ways. And it's good to know that story, because then we understand why it's in the situation it's in today. So we're saying, the goal of our project is to fight inequality by saying to people, let's pause, let's consider our history, and then from that we will have a better foundation for moving forward. And ours is a simple, time-limited project. It's
one of the important things of the process that Dr. Polillo described is that the prevailing culture would say that history is as you were taught in the old books. What this is saying is, no, we have to look at our history again. Notice that this doesn't say African American History Month.
Right,
It says, look again at who we really are and what has brought us from then to now. Now that sets the stage. So if any pastor or any community group decides that we're going to have some interfaith dialogues around racism, it becomes a normal thing then. Well, of course you're going to have independent dialogues around racism, because look at what's happened over the last 400 years. So this is a part of, when we talk about participatory practice, questioning the status quo, identifying where the problems are. That third part is critical, creating new ways of seeing and understanding the world. Unless we are on the same page about this, it'll always be a fight just to have the discussion about racism. Whereas, as hopefully, and the importance that Dr. Polillo said of having these celebrations all over, is that then in maybe every community that we can get our hands on, next year is going to change. Be part of the big push to change the whole concept of what it is we're dealing with. So that all the work that's being done at the University of Orange and other things, that's still marching on. But there's going to be hopefully a great push forward for them, because the concept generally about what is our history is got to change, and this will be a part of it. Say something about the arts stuff. People
it says people do actually change, and unexpectedly, all of a sudden, they say no, they can't change, and then they will. So the New York Times decided, for reasons I don't know, that they would look at all their obituaries, and they counted all the obituaries from 1851 to the present, and they found out that 80% of them were of men, mostly white men. And they decided that this was improper, and that they would change that policy, and they would change it going forward, and they would change it by doing historical ones that they had overlooked, like Ida B. Wells, the great fighter of lynching. And so, Monday morning's paper was a classic. You opened it up, and there was a historical one, and there was a black woman, and there was a black man, and there was a white man on the obituary pages. These deep stories, because they hadn't changed their policy. So, and part of this whole process of the 400 years is that we have to look at our history actually with skepticism, because until we actually look at it together collectively, putting all our stories into finding all the threads and how they weave together, we won't actually know anything. I didn't know anything about the colonial era when I started this. I was shocked to learn about the Powhatan Wars that went on for 50 years, but that's how they got the land to make plantations, to have slavery. I didn't know how slavery evolved through the colonies over that 50-year period. So many things that I've learned as part of this project. This makes me curious about our history. Then we find these things that we're like, that's really, I don't like that, let's change it. And I've also, because I've been curious and following this, just seen so many stories of people who have looked at their history in one way or another and changed something. So we literally, not just that I don't know the facts, but I can find them in a book, but that they're really things that we haven't investigated. And that we have to, so it's both mystery and curiosity and opportunity and a point of change.
If you could take just a minute to jot a couple things down on paper, and if you need to go home, please do that. But I just wanted
that you want to share is that.
Yeah. So
it's great to be here with you.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Who's the executive presbyter for the Presbytery of New York, and so I'm just curious, Bob, what was something that you found helpful in this seminar this evening?
What I found helpful was her longer-term picture of the dynamics that were destroying the communities, and I appreciated some of the academic way she approached it, and not just anecdotal stories. It was well researched, and I've experienced the very things that she showed through pictures of what used to be and what came when neighborhoods, especially disenfranchised, poor African American neighborhoods, often were the routes where new things were put through, roads were put through, and that resonated with me. Really did. Really did. I've seen that happen in too many cities.
What are some things as you go and visit your congregations that you see are positive signs of building up community and making good use of their buildings?
Well, the city of New York, for instance, has not enough space for the 60-something, 80-something thousand people who are homeless. And so they need partnerships. And so one of the partnerships that started with one of our churches that had space, and it came at some cost internal to the church, because the church wasn't always really that enthusiastic about inviting homeless people into their basement, or not basement, but into their social hall, and it changed their whole dynamic of social hall. But the city partnered with the church and has now launched a new debt stabilization program that's now in 3 of our Presbyterian churches, because they find the support that they're receiving with partnership with the city to be working well, and the city needs the space, so it's a win for the city to have it. And so it's the churches can open their doors in neighborhoods that otherwise might say no, we don't want to care for people like the homeless. And the other piece is how to repurpose property. You know the story, First Jamaica, and they had a parking lot. They gave up the parking lot to put in about 163 units of affordable housing, different gradations of affordability. and it's going to be a partnership between the church and the developer. They're going to put in a community health clinic because they think that we need health clinics also in some of our urban neighborhoods. They're going to put in a child care center, and one of the anchors of that is going to be a bank. Yeah. So a bank will always be, a place where there'll be continual people, there's money in there. So they've worked out this kind of diverse partnership with repurposing their property. So they studied the neighborhood before they decided on that partnership. What does this neighborhood need? And affordable housing was what they kept hearing. So that shows the church is really invested in building up the community, not destroying it.
So I have one other question, and that is, if you had your top 3 pieces of advice to congregations about the first steps that they need to be thinking about in terms of using their property to build up their neighborhood and to care for the people who are in their neighborhood, what are some things you would say?
First thing I like to tell any new pastor or any pastor in the church is make sure you've had conversations with key players in the community to get a feel for what this community is about, what's going on. That can be school principals, because they often know who are the newest population groups coming in. Even the police can know sometimes there may be an opiate problem, that people are committing suicide, and maybe other parts of the community don't even know, but the police are aware this is happening. There are urban planners that can tell about trends. There are also community leaders that have been activists in the community, and they're often long-term perspective is helpful. And the people who work with the poor and the disenfranchised to find out what is it that are the great needs of the community, and then to begin to make assessments. What can our church do? Who do we need to partner with? And that's what I say, kind of do an inventory of your neighborhood and start there, and then see what the church can partner with.
So we talked about root theology today, and that is really based on this very connectional approach, that relationship building approach. I think a curiosity about who's around you and what are the gifts that they have to bring and what are the struggles that they bring. And I think that's a good place for churches to begin.
Yeah, I do too. Glad you did this tonight.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, thank you.
Now that we've had a chance to sort of mull over this whole idea of root shot, talk about some of the responses to the Urban Alchemy, some of the 9 ways you can really begin to address this. How does it hit you where you're learning and working? How do these concepts?
So I'm an attorney. We work with faith-based institutions to try and help them be, of the community and help support the community and use their real property assets to do that. And it's given me a lot to think about in that work, right? Because the mission part has always been central to how faith-based institutions are using their real property, but it also has to be part of how they're actually doing their work. And so their real property is only part of that. And so I think for me, this made things much more complicated in that the discussion on mission has to be so much broader about the long-term vision of how that organization is of the community. And so I'm looking forward to more conversations, I think.
So as a seminary student, I think that diving into this a lot more would be beneficial for people that are just coming through seminary and coming out of seminary that are going to be tackling these issues in their communities. I found the workshop tonight to be very insightful for getting ideas of where I need to pursue more in my training, especially with my context being, I'm very interested in working more in urban communities.
Yes.
So, I find this as being a very, and I think even people that are working in urban, suburban communities need to understand where people are coming from or where they've been, or what could happen if something changes.
One of the things that impressed me about the conversation was the central role of connecting and building relationship.
Yeah.
No matter what the issue is or what you're trying to respond to, that you have to have those relationships and be sort of nurturing them in order to even have the conversation. And the trust that's built as you have those relationships is the stuff you need to make the difficult decisions.
The other thing that I guess sort of jumped out at me was the importance of physical space to those relationships. So what Dr. Fullilove was talking about in her book was how the space created safety where you could have those relationships, and she showed us pictures of what were public spaces where there were interactions, even if it was the public space of the Sunday school, or the somewhat public space of the art studio, or the public space of the street where the gentlemen are playing checkers, or the public space of the steps where there's the marching band, right? There's all of this safe space, this community where these interactions, these relationships are happening. And I think part of what we're talking about is, some by design, some by ignorance, some by nature being very upset with how we have taken advantage of it, it is decimating all of our spaces, in particular our community spaces in which to interact. And so figuring out how we create those spaces, I think maybe first, but certainly as a part of creating those relationships, to me is so critical.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I was most fascinated with the photos that were presented in this, and the one that really resonated most with me was the picture of where they built the entertainment center, the arena in the middle of town, and just wiped out many neighborhoods, blocks and blocks of neighborhoods, for economic gain, for something that is not without a lot of thought. I think that's the part that really bothered me most, is that it was just like, well, let's plant this and we're going to put this here, but we'll just take over this land because it's delight.
It demonstrated the absence of real relationship.
Exactly.
Between the leaders who made those decisions and the folks.
Yes. Well, this is where you don't have trust. How do you trust when all of a sudden they've just come through and take it?
This is also, and I guess I'm the only non-seminarian here or theologian, but it seems so apparent to me, right? This is the role, or at least a role, of the church, right? The church is for the powerless, is for the downtrodden, and in that situation, the power was that room of white men who decided that this is where we're going to plunk our opera house.
Right.
And maybe, in all honesty to them, they thought that it was blighted, but none of them lived there, right? None of them.
The definition of blight is relative, right?
Yeah, exactly.
These are vibrant communities.
Exactly.
From the community's point of view.
Exactly.
Like Mindy said, you could buff it up a little bit, you could improve this and that, but the community's life and roots were there.
Yeah.
To be built on rather than to be destroyed.
And think of it. Some of it is, it can be buffed up. Some of it is that's the home of it, right? Like you've got. I think of my own house. I've got, the squeaky stairs, right? Could that be fixed? Of course not. But that's my home. It's lived in.
Yes.
It's not supposed to be abolished. That's the community of it. And so. The visual, exactly as you say, of that, like how grossly mistaken.
Share with me again your names and how you got to the seminar today.
Sure. So, Jason LeBate, I'm an attorney with the law firm Goldstein Hall, and the firm specializes in community development and affordable housing. And my own journey in getting to them was working in community development and financial empowerment before I was an attorney. So I've sort of been doing this and moving towards this my entire career.
So I'm Dan DeBrucker. I'm a student here at Union Theological Seminary. I'm also the organizer to the Presbyterian Network on Homelessness. I work on a lot of issues around affordable housing. Been a social worker for well over 20 years, specializing in homelessness. So this has been trying to. I'm so grateful for this opportunity and also for this book, because it's finally saying what we've been thinking, just haven't been able to put it out there.
Well, for the New York State Council, I just know that having you both here means that other groups and other folks who are committed to this kind of work were also here because you were here. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marcia Fingal, and I'm the Chief Outreach Officer for Intersections International. I'm also the Global Impact Program Manager. And tonight was really amazing, because I think it is so important to talk about the role of the church and how the church can continue to be relevant in the 21st century. I think the collegiate church is a fantastic model of one church. We have 5 distinct ministries, 4 brick and mortar, and then we have a 5th ministry, Intersections. And Intersections is sort of our missional work in the world. We sort of go out. We go to Puerto Rico. We go to Berlin. We go to the Middle East to really look at how peacemaking can happen, to really look at how we can support the most marginalized people, because we operate from this idea of Titus 3:14, meeting the most urgent need for the marginalized against us. So at Intersections, we really follow the idea of Titus 3:14, meeting the most urgent need. So how can we do that for people who are on the fringe? And so we want to look at that, and we want the church to be relevant. We want the church to really take a part in how communities develop and grow and thrive. The church is still relevant, and we have to continue to make that real for folks. It's not just 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. There's a lot of church happens every day, and how do we go out into the world and be Christ in the world? And I think in the collegiate system and in Intersections, we're really looking at fresh new ways of being church in the world. I thought it was really great how Dr. Fullilove really broke down for us how communities become disinvested, how areas just don't become blighted overnight. There's a systemic way of things happening, and how she outlined that tonight was really helpful. I mean, when you look at cities like Newark, for example, I don't live too far from Newark, and you see how perhaps the 1968 riots, how drug addiction, the AIDS epidemic, just urban blight came to that city, and they're climbing out of that. I mean, it's been all these years later, and there's some real genesis starting to happen in parts of Newark. But I also saw how that divestment really impacted the city, and Dr. Fullilove tonight really showed us the tangible steps that were taken to really destroy communities. But then she also ended on an up note, saying that it's possible to rebuild our cities. And so there's a lot of work to be done in urban areas, and the church can play a role in that.